it is good to be back with you. We've been on a journey together. Is anyone just joining us? Was anyone not here for the morning presentation? Did I see a hand go up?
Yeah, one hand, yeah.
Okay, a few hands. So let me just quickly bring you up to speed. Greg and I together will try to do it for you. But we've been looking at a perplexing challenge in society today, and that is people debating the topic of whether religion's good or bad. And Greg, we found out really that it could be either, didn't we?
That's right. We found that looking at studies that over half of the studies show a positive relationship between religiosity and intrinsic religion and health, blood pressure specifically. But we also found some studies that had it was a negative correlation or a negative association where having a religious experience made the health worse.
So when we wrote our book, 30 Days to Natural Blood Pressure Control, we felt it was very important, based on the research, to include a spiritual component. But how would we find what type of spirituality to put in a book that was designed to appeal to everyone across the spiritual spectrum, whether they're Jews or atheists, Buddhists, Christians, agnostics, whatever it might be? And we came up with thinking that one of the best crystallizations in all of antiquity of a healthy spirituality was found where, Greg?
On the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' sermon covering the Beatitudes, which we covered this morning.
Now, we didn't mention something this morning that we do share in the book. Back in 2004, the American Psychological Association, not a religious group, published a book called Character, Strengths, and Virtues. And the point is, secular people today are realizing that we have not paid enough emphasis to healthy virtues, to healthy qualities, actually these very qualities that Jesus identified in the Beatitudes.
Yeah, you know, when you do your psychological training, whatever branch that you might be in, you spend most of your time learning about all the problems, right? All the ways that mental health has gone wrong. And they realized that there was this huge void in studying what was right about mental health and about the virtues and strengths and mental strengths, etc. And so we felt that the Beatitudes really encapsulated some of those core aspects.
So this morning we talked about the power of humility and how important that was in our relationships. And we've tried to be humble in your midst. And if we've acted too highfalutin, or if we just walked past some of you and you thought we were ignoring you, it was probably just because I was wondering if I'd wiped my face or not after lunch, okay? So really, we realize we're all on this journey together. Did I miss something? Okay. Okay. But really, and so we're oh, yeah. I actually did have some floss, but thanks for looking out for me. I am just so glad we've been developing some good rapport with many of you. It's unusual that after a single lecture, someone will actually offer me one of their flossing devices. But that's very touching. So we talked about acknowledging our pain. That's something that we often avoid, isn't it, Greg?
Absolutely. You know, pain is something that you avoid, right? You touch the stove as a child and you don't do that again when it's hot. And yet there's something in the spiritual experience that the painful experience that we often have, realizing the truth of where we're at sometimes, that we found ourselves in a big hole and we don't know how to get out, so to speak. And that can be very painful to acknowledge, but that acknowledging can be very therapeutic on a spiritual sense and for your physical body as well.
And one of the things that we've had a big concern about is helping people to be open about areas where they're struggling. Because what we're finding, and we talked a little bit about this, supportive communities actually rely on people being willing to share and support one another. So we talked about the 12-step programs and how they're really based on this concept of repentance, acknowledging where you're falling short, acknowledging your pain, and then realizing that you want to make a change. We had someone actually come up to us after the presentation, didn't we, who's very much a part of that recovery community.
That's right, and he was very grateful that we mentioned it, and he said that when he joined whichever community he did, that he very much felt that there was a spiritual repentance experience that was central to that for him.
So just to pick up on this a little as we segue into our third of the Beatitudes, our third timeless prescriptions for health and wholeness, one of the things we've been doing, Greg and Trudy and I, the three of us, the co-authors of this book, is we have been doing seminars in other venues where we're trying to mobilize community people to use the resources that we now have to do programs in their own home, in their workplace, their hospital, their community center, their church. And so what we're doing here is something that, yes, we enjoy giving these presentations, but we also have resources so you can actually be a resource in your community. For example, one of the things we have, it's free on our website. The website is CompassHealth.net. How can you remember that? CompassHealth.net. What good is a compass? What does it do for you? Gives you direction. Okay, so Compass, Health, we're speaking about health, right? And why.net? Now, depending on the audience, I'll sometimes give a different answer. Why are you smiling?
Well, I know what you're going to say.
What am I going to say?
You're going to say that it's like a net. You're reaching out to people to help them, improve their blood pressure.
Boy, that was a great answer, but that was not what I was going to say. I was going to say because Jesus commissioned us to be fishers of men. Okay, so compasshealth.net. But that sometimes I will say that. So Greg is learning, but he just has not yet mastered the art of reading my mind. Okay? Unlike probably what you've mastered with your wife.
Well, they say that you have to be married for 20 years before you can read your spouse's mind 80% of the time, and we're nowhere close to that.
Okay. Thanks for keeping the record straight. Okay, let's talk about the third of these timeless health prescriptions. Walk us through this a little bit, Greg.
Okay, number 3, if you remember, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. So what is meekness? This idea of submission in the midst often of controversy or of conflict. That's what meekness really has to do with. Humility and meekness are not the same. You might at first think, well, those are kind of the same terms, aren't they? But they're not exactly the same. Humility is more of a general idea of going lower to meet someone where they're at, so to speak. But meekness often is done in the midst of conflict or in the midst of difficulty.
Now let's just think about meekness for a minute. In our culture, is meekness generally valued? Now I know it was a long time ago, and some of you are glad it seems like a long time ago, but pretty much the whole U.S. was focused about exactly a year ago on a very major political event that took place in our country, right? It was an election year where every congressman and congresswoman was up for re-election, right? We following along with this? The presidency was being contested. We're following along? I know some of you don't want to think about this. I don't know that I like to think about it either. But my point is, how many of you saw those commercials where they said, vote for blank, the meekest candidate? How many of you heard that? Nothing like that, was it, Greg?
I don't remember that at all.
So meekness is often not valued in our culture, but Jesus was saying, blessed are the meek. Blessed are the meek. We see perhaps the greatest example of meekness in Jesus himself. Greg, there's that olive garden not far from where Jesus was crucified, outside the city of Jerusalem, Gethsemane. What there showed us the meekness of Jesus?
Yeah, if you recall, Jesus knows that his death is imminent, and he's trying to do what he believes his Father in heaven wants him to do. And yet there's something in him that's shying away from it in a very great way. And so if you see the quote here Jesus is crying out on his hands and knees in a tremendous situation of feeling overwhelmed by what he's going to have to go through. And he says, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." And then once the cross came, he's there on the cross. And the words as he was dying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This feeling of submission, the sense of submission, even though he doesn't have any immediate affirmation that what he's doing is the right thing. And yet he somehow knew that it was the right thing to do, which was the calling of his life. And so submitting to a greater principle or God, whatever the situation is extremely important, and not basing your own decisions on your own feelings only. Because your feelings can lead you astray. Jesus' feelings in the midst of this were, I don't want to go through with this. This is overwhelming. And yet he submitted to that principle, and we submit to health principles in almost like that, don't we, David?
No, it's really very important, the transition Dr. Greg is making. Because if you think about it, any health counsel that we receive, any prescription given by a doctor, any recommendation for a procedure given by a health professional, it will benefit you not one whit unless you're willing to submit to the judgment of that individual, right? Now, both Greg and I believe in making decisions jointly with our patients. So it's not me as the doctor telling someone what to do, but it's kind of coming alongside them and looking at the problem and talking through things. But the point is still there's a level of submission, even when you acknowledge something. Patient may say, well, it looks like I really need to do that. I say, yeah, I really think you need this surgery. I mean, your aorta is ballooned out 9 centimeters. Usually we say once it's 5 centimeters, you're in imminent danger of it rupturing, but 9 centimeters, just about to blow. And by the way, aortic aneurysms very closely connected with high blood pressure. So this is ballooning of that large artery that leaves the heart. And it first starts in the chest, so we call it the thoracic aorta. It kind of comes down like a cane and then goes into the abdomen. We call it the abdominal aorta. So if that artery starts to balloon, especially under the influence of high blood pressure and other risk factors for arterial disease, if it does rupture, Greg, no big deal, right?
Yeah, no big deal, right?
So give us
David, yeah, what do you think? What do you think your chances of living are if that ruptures? What do you think?
Okay, I see some people motioning 0. It's actually better than 0. But it is directly related to how close you are to a hospital. Last figure I saw was somewhere around 10%.
Yeah, very low. Very low chance of living.
So you want to intervene early. So in other words, if you've got a 9-centimeter abdominal aortic aneurysm and the doctor's explaining this to you and you say, well, I think I need surgery, and the doctor says, yes, I really think you do, let me refer you to the surgeon, you're still going to have to submit, aren't you?
And how much better to submit 30 years earlier and avoid the various things that might have raised the blood pressure and messed up the arteries that led to that condition.
This is really sobering stuff. Because, if they do some high-tech surgery and save you from the brink of death, or if you have a stroke and you get very good neurologic care and you have very little residual after the stroke, you will extol the doctors, won't you? Oh, I got such great care in that hospital. They got me right in. They gave me the clot-busting drug and whatever they did for you. If you had a bleeding stroke, they did. But here's the deal. Here's the deal. Wouldn't it be better right now to get your blood pressure down to a really safe level? But you know what happens, Greg? What do you think? If someone here today, they get excited about this, maybe they even get the book. We'll have books at when we finish this evening, we'll have resources and all. But let's say they go home with the book, they read it, and they lower their blood pressure, 20, 30 points, they get off their medications. What are the odds that they're going to say that we saved their life?
Well, I mean, I don't care if they say that they don't say that I saved their life, but you know, it's much, what you're saying is it's much less glamorous, right? The beautiful building of the hospital, OHSU, all this glamour, so to speak. And they waltz you in there and save your life at the brink of death. You know, how glamorous is that? And, you know, $150,000 later, so to speak. You know, how much better is it to do something that's much less glamorous and produces much better health? You know, if more of us did that, we'd have a lot smaller hospitals, you know?
So what our challenge is for you today, as we're talking about this beatitude of being meek and submitting, try to get the best health information and submit to that information, okay? So if your lifestyle is out of harmony with the best way to live, what are we recommending? What are we recommending, Greg?
Well, realize that also that we're recommending to submit and to experience meekness. But realize that's a process, right? There's something inside of us sometimes that pushes against that. Anyone experience that? You know, you're used to kind of rolling into the McDonald's or whatever, or rolling over to a donut shop. In Canada, donut shops are a big deal. I don't know if you've been to a few donut shops. And we do a lot of these kinds of things that we're used to doing, maybe we've done for a long time, and then we realize, wait a minute, there's too much sodium in that, or wait a minute, there's too much sugar, and I've been gaining weight, I need to lower my weight. And we want to submit to that better thought, but we struggle to obtain that, don't we, David? Sometimes.
We do. I have a whole series that I call Changing Bad Habits for Good. It's 2 half-hour presentations on a DVD. And we talk about this dynamic in it. And the bottom line is most of us kick and scream when it comes to making any lifestyle changes. But the good news is that every one of us can develop new enjoyments. And once you realize that, and I'll tell you, Greg, once I realized, I said, well, wait, when it finally got through my thick skull, and I realized that I could develop new enjoyments, I said, well, why don't I just pick an enjoyment for the best, best foods, the best lifestyle habits? Have you seen some of that in your own life too?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, when you try something brand new, it first feels weird, it seems kind of odd, different. And yet, once you've tried that food, especially if it's prepared lovingly and caringly by your loved one, or you prepare it and you do a really good job and it's attractive, you know what? That food becomes more and more acceptable. And pretty soon you really enjoy that food very, very much, for example, with food. And so the bottom line, again, is your choices determine your preferences, not the other way around. We think our preferences determine our choices. But it's because of all our past choices that we have the preferences we have. And so our choices determine our preferences. And so if you want to have different preferences, you need to make different choices now.
So, for example, let's make this practical. How many of you went downstairs and had the meal? Was it most all of us? Okay. So let's just imagine this. So there's all this food, right, on the table here. And I'm coming along, and I'm taking some of the rice, and I'm getting some of the beans here, and I guess I'm supposed to be filmed, and they don't want to take pictures of you guys.
Over there.
Okay. So anyway, so we're getting all this food. You got the picture, and I put the food on my plate, and as I'm walking to my table, what would have happened if this guy here? I mean, he looks very nice, doesn't he? And he said, why have you got that on your plate? Go ahead and say it.
Whoa. What's going on, David? What do you have there?
Well, you can see what I've got.
Yeah, those Snickers bars there. I don't know.
And he's implying, like, why did I get those, right? And I'll say, well, I got them because I like them. Now, what would you do if after I said that to Greg, he said wrong? He said, wrong. He said, why did you choose those particular foods? I said, I got them because I liked them. And he said, wrong. And then the next words out of his mouth are, you like those because you got them. You see the difference? You didn't get those things because you liked them. You liked them because you got them. Now, some of you are just kind of looking like, what is this guy saying?
Brain twister, huh?
Yeah, I'm playing games with you, but it's true. The foods you habitually take are the foods you develop an enjoyment for. So if you want to like something different, what do you have to do? You have to take something different. You have to change your behavior. And we're giving you in short order, in a few minutes, what we spent an hour trying to explain. But if you catch that, you can save watching the video, because that's one of the key points, that we can develop new enjoyments. Once you know that, then when you read these...
You can love broccoli.
That's right.
You can fall in love with asparagus. And be like, wow, this is amazing stuff. This is way better than a Snickers bar. Right?
So submission, when it comes to physical things, interfaces with submitting to health principles in the Bible, because there's that spiritual and physical. Help us see some of that.
Yeah, that's right. This is some interesting material here. So as we thought through this, we realized that the Bible has a lot of health principles in it that, through the years, the Jewish nation was expected to submit to. I mean, look at some of this stuff. I think some of this is foundational to our culture, obviously. Personal cleanliness was a major issue. Avoiding food and water contamination. We have whole departments studying that and improving that in our culture. Mold remediation of buildings. Proper sewage disposal. Avoiding inbreeding. Infectious disease prevention. With the inbreeding thing, we studied some of the islands of Croatia where they don't have a lot of access to a wide variety of people, and there's just a few families there. And they tend to have a lot of inbreeding because of that. Guess what the rates of high blood pressure are? Many-fold higher. And the researchers found that the reason for that was because of the great deal of inbreeding that was occurring on those islands. And so blood pressure inbreeding plays a role in blood pressure. Oh, and here it is. Leviticus 18 speaks about that, not having sexual relations with close relatives. And there's the Croatian islands data. 36% of all hypertension cases on 3 Croatian islands. And we have the reference in our book if you want to read up more on that. Pretty interesting stuff. Cleanliness and blood pressure, with bathing. Did you know that if you take a hot bath, that you lower your blood pressure for the next 60 minutes? Interesting.
So a lot of interesting applications there, but we need to hasten on now to the topic of aspiring. That's the 4th beatitude. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. What does that have to do with aspiring? The Bible is actually almost a little bit confusing on this topic of aspiration, because it seems in some places the Bible is actually calling us not to aspire.
Yeah, so on the one hand, believers are called to be content. Be content with wherever you're at, whatever position you're in. If it's a hard, difficult position, trying to be content. But on the other hand, reaching higher and going to a better way of living, a better lifestyle, better thinking habits, whatever the details are. Hunger and thirst for righteousness, that better right idea, however that plays out.
And both of these aspects are important for optimal health. So let's look at the first one. This is contentment. So it's important to be content. Greg, this is probably one of the great promises that comes really from the Sermon on the Mount.
That's right.
A little ways after the Beatitudes.
Yeah, great quote. If you don't know it, I recommend you learn it. Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So what you'll wear, those kinds of things, various things that we worry about every day, our food. Therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. So focus on today. Focus on being content today with whatever your tasks are.
Isn't it interesting how in this verse there's both that element of contentment and not being anxious, but also that element of striving for righteousness, you see? Seeking God's kingdom, seeking righteousness. So we're seeking God-likeness, we're seeking to come close to God, and at the same time, we're being content. We're not getting worried. Now, we're glad there's some young people in our audience because they never worry, right? Are you guys in school right now? Yeah, let me get your names here just so we can put a name to the faces. What's your name?
Josiah.
Josiah. That is a tremendous name. That's one of my favorite kings in the Bible. Did you know he was a king in the Bible?
Yes.
Okay. He was really a good king, but he made a mistake. Did you know that?
No.
Okay. Well, you can read about that. He, as I remember the story, he went out to fight Pharaoh Necho, and that was his end. Okay. So don't go fighting anyone. Can you take that take-home message?
Okay.
Okay. You seem to be very content. You're in school, Josiah? So you never have any tests probably, because you look like you never get worried. Do you ever have any tests in school?
Yes.
Now, they teach us in medical school how to ask open-ended and closed-ended questions. And I've been asking him some very good closed-ended questions, so he just keeps giving me these one-word answers. Isn't that correct? Okay. So who is this next to you, Josiah?
Mila.
Why do you keep giving me one-word answers?
Because you keep asking me closed-end questions.
Closed-end questions.
Yeah, I asked you this. So Mila, is she your sister? So Mila, are you in school too?
Yes.
I'm going to ask you an open-ended question now. You want to hear what an open-ended question sounds like? What do you like about these lectures?
I like it. Talks about spiritual health.
Whoa, that was a good answer. She likes it because it talks about spiritual health. I like these kids. I'm always impressed when kids sit near the front row. By the way, the teachers always say the smartest students sit up near the front. And some of them in back, we don't want to make them feel badly, but if you guys want to raise higher in the expectations or assessments, at least, of the teachers, you can come up further forward. There is room up here. And now some of them are worried now that I'm going to ask them questions, Greg, aren't they? Would you be worried if you were sitting up front?
I don't think anyone would ask me a question.
Are you guys worried that I'm going to ask you questions, more questions? Do you see? They're illustrating how they're not anxious. They're not even worried that I'm going to ask them questions in the front row. But you catch the point here? These two aspects, contentment and striving for something better. Did Paul himself master this, Greg?
He was striving for it, I think, his whole life. And here's a quote that we love about contentment. In the midst of some really trying experiences that Paul had, I've learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. And that was very real for him. There were times where he had very little food. There was times where he was in prison. There was times where he was giving a lecture to thousands of people. So he had that kind of variation in his own life.
We spend a whole chapter in our book speaking about stress. And if you don't realize it, stress is a contributor to many of the health issues we have in America and in the world. So whether it's high blood pressure, whether it's diabetes, whether it's heart rhythm problems, the list just seems to go on and on. What about cancer? Is stress on that list too?
Well, cancer and stress, it's more of a convoluted issue there, but I have personally known people who went through a great deal of stress and then later got cancer a few months later. So I think there is a relationship there. It's not always clear.
So the point is basically contentment is powerful, and the Bible models this. So Jesus, the Bible, calls us to be content, but at the same time, the Bible calls us not to be content. Help us see the balance there, Greg.
Yeah, so this other part of the Beatitudes, actually a little after the Beatitudes, right in there, right in the beginning there, right after the blessed statements, Jesus moves on to this other statement: let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. And so when you master something, when you are achieving something that is of a great value to others, for example, that gives an opportunity for those folks to, quotes, glorify or rejoice and give glory to God because of the expertise that you've developed. And so we should all be striving to become experts in whatever area of life God has called us to.
Well, there is medical science showing that when we aspire, when we strive for something greater, and then when we're content, all of these things help with our health. And whether a person's religious or not, I think everyone would agree that the world would be a better place if everyone was seeking to be more righteous, have more righteous values like integrity and kindness and humility. Wouldn't you say? In fact, we could use a greater dose of that in the public marketplace. In fact, if you think about it, it seems like a lot of headlines have been grabbed lately by people who haven't been acting with integrity or humility or righteousness. Would you say that's a fair characterization of some of the media we've been hearing lately? So, Greg, this has some amazing relationships with brain chemistry. So although we'll be speaking more later today about neurochemistry and brain health, this is a great place to talk about this amazing connection.
Absolutely. You know, loving relationships, trusting relationships produces hormones in our body and in our brain that help foster those relationships to become even more close. And so there's this hormone called oxytocin. In medical school, when we learn about that, we learn about it in relation to breastfeeding usually. And it has to do with bonding with the baby when a mother's breastfeeding. But you also form that hormone when you're engaging in trusting, loving relationships with each other. And that helps you to actually continue to deepen that trusting relationship. If that oxytocin wasn't there, you would lose your interest in deepening a relationship.
Now, I'm always a little bit worried about talking about this in a church because, this is really I'm being honest with you, because an unethical faith community could start piping in oxytocin through the vents. Really, they could. And what they found with oxytocin, you see it there on the bottom, is if you breathe in oxytocin through a nasal spray, it will make you more generous. So could you imagine if a church had this circulating in the ambient air, and then they had that eloquent offering appeal? Everybody, just think what could happen. But this is real science, and oxytocin is the trust hormone. So trust increases oxytocin levels in the brain, like Greg was explaining, and that in turn helps us to be more trusting of the individual in question. So the whole point is, if we're cultivating righteousness, if we're allowing God to put his character in us, if you will, it helps us to be more trustworthy, and then our social relationships be characterized by things that actually are enhancing our brain health and helping us as a community to improve our health. I think that's profound.
Absolutely, and especially I think of this in terms of small children, babies. You know, I've often said to mothers, the first year of a baby's life is all about trust. And the baby is bathing in oxytocin, and the mother's bathing in oxytocin as the child learns to trust its mother. And that's a huge concept that if people don't get that, they have tremendous mental health problems as a result.
We spoke about stress, and oxytocin actually suppresses stress signals. It helps in relational tensions. So here's the message. You may think spirituality is just a personal issue. My whole point, and Greg's whole point, and Trudy's point, we wrote this chapter, is your spirituality affects all the people around you. So someone says, well, I'm not a spiritual person. Well, the point is we're all spiritual beings. We all have things that give meaning and purpose to our lives. And we're saying if we focus on being more righteous, if we focus on being better people, this helps us and it helps our communities.
Yeah, so if you have a really wonderful conversation with someone and you've really felt good about it, and then you get into Portland traffic and you're driving there and it's, just eking along, and it takes an hour to go 3 exits on the 205, so to speak, and your stress levels just don't go up nearly as much in that moment. But if you had been in an argument right before you got into the car, and then you're going along, what's going to happen to your stress levels, or what could happen to your stress levels in the midst of more emotional tension and a lack of oxytocin? You start to get really fumed, and what happens to your blood pressure? It could go up high, and if it goes up high enough, you might get chest pain, or you might start getting a severe headache, or start to become confused. And you show up at home, and your wife or your husband's like, I think we're going to the hospital now. So this can play a huge role in how your health plays out.
So really the first 4 Beatitudes that we've looked at, if we were to step back, they're really talking about inner strengths. We've talked about things like submission and meekness and humility and mourning. We want to just take a moment and see if you have any questions about those first 4 Beatitudes, because the next 4 Beatitudes really focus on our relationship with others even more directly. So the first 4 are more these inner strengths, and then the last 4 are more in our relationship with others. Do you have any comments or questions, any reaction to what we've looked at?
I know it's a big group. It's not always easy to raise your hand, but please feel comfortable. We're all in this together.
I can see Josiah's just wanting to say something here. Yeah, I'm sure. You want to say something? It could be a one-word thing. Did you want to say something?
No.
Okay. Thanks for sharing. Not too many people would be willing to share so openly. Okay? Very good. Now tell me that sister's name. She doesn't have the name of a king in the Bible, so I'm having a hard time remembering her name. So what is her name again? Myla. M-Y-L-A? Yes. Really? M-Y-L-A. So do you want to tell us about your name?
No. I don't know.
Okay. She doesn't want to tell us about her name.
We don't want to create stress hormones in her.
Am I stressing you out at all? Oh, okay, good. I still have friends up here. One of the things we're trained to do is read body language. And when I start picking on the people in the front row, the body language that tells me they're usually at least somewhat okay with it is when they still keep sitting there. If they slipped out and went to the back, I'd know, well, I just pushed it a little too far, right? Yeah, okay. So basically what this sounds like is all of you, there's probably one of 3 options, Greg, I would say, that they're speaking very loudly, even though they're not saying much. One is crystal clear. They're understanding this all. Second possible option is not only is the material soothing to them, but the meal was very good and they're in some kind of dreamlike state. Okay?
And that's not so bad. That's part of what we're trying to do to make blood pressures better.
That's right. And then the third option may be that just they're maybe inhibited from saying how none of this makes any sense.
And that makes sense too.
Okay. Anyone want to break the ice, or you want us to hasten on to number 5? Okay. Are you going to help us out here? Wow. So introduce yourself for us, just so everyone doesn't feel like you're just some stranger that came up front. My name is Jed. Jed. J-E-D. And is Jed's mic working? The blue mic, is that working? It is now. It is.
It should be now.
Oh, there we
yes,
go.
There we go.
Now, Jed, since you're up here, some of you, maybe you know, do you realize I'm a radio host? Do you all know that? Yeah, I have a weekly radio show. It's on about 150 stations. And many people, do you know this, Jed?
I heard Thursday night that
You did?
you were a host of a radio show, yes.
And do you know what the name of the show is?
I do not, except your company name was CompassHealth, I believe.
Wow, CompassHealth.net.
Or net. Because you have to go fishing for something
Okay.
with your nets.
Okay, so Jed's catching on, but the radio show I host is called American Indian Living.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, for many years I lived in Oklahoma, have done a lot of work with Native Americans. So part of my job is to interview people. So I just always love it when interesting people are behind a mic with me. And now that Jed has this mic, I just feel right at home, like we can have just a little break here from the lecture because no one wanted to interact, but Jed willingly came up knowing that I would probably interview him. Now, tell me the truth. I have actually heard that you have a doctoral degree.
You can say that.
Do they call it a Juris Doctorate or something like that?
They call it a jurisprudence doctorate, correct.
So you're a lawyer?
Technically, no.
Oh, technically, no. What's the difference between a JD and a lawyer?
You can have the degree, but if you cannot have a license unless you're admitted to the bar.
I see. And you've chosen to take your legal training and your sharp legal analytical mind and apply it to something else. Is that true?
That's a very loaded question. There's a lot of presupposition. There's nothing sharp about my mind or anything like that.
Well, you sure picked up on how loaded the question was.
Yes, I am currently back in school.
And what are you studying for?
I'm studying naturopathic medicine.
You know, I really, some MDs aren't the kindest to NDs, naturopathic doctors, but I really value naturopathic physicians. I've had the privilege of working with them in professional contexts over the years. So I was very encouraged to hear about your future career track. So is this resonating with you as a future ND?
What you're speaking about?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Good.
And in fact, the school that I attend to was founded by an ex-Seventh-day Adventist.
Really?
Yes, Dr. Spalding. I'm trying to remember his first name. But they do also teach principles that you've been talking about at the school. They do also, among Seventh-day Adventists, there's an acronym called New START, which stands for Nutrition, Exercise, Water, Temperance, Rest. Oh, START, S. Sunshine, Temperance, Air, Rest, and Trusting God. And they actually use that over at the school.
Do they
and
really?
Talk about how Seventh-day Adventists have come up with this acronym, and they talk about the 8 fundamentals of health. And they also talk about hydrotherapy quite a bit, and they use textbooks that are written by the Thrash doctors.
Really?
So Agatha
Very interesting.
and Calvin Thrash, MDs.
Wow, I'm getting an education here. You find it? Now, this is going to date the last time I searched naturopathic institutions in the U.S. and in North America and Canada. But last time I looked, there were only like 5 certified or accredited programs. Is that number increased?
It has increased. The school that I attend right here across the bridge from the Ross Island Bridge is the oldest of the naturopathic institutions. It's actually the original one. Back in 1956, I believe, it was founded, again, by that ex-Adventist, Dr. Spalding. But from there, we've had multiple different schools. Graduates would go to different areas and start their own schools.
Okay.
So yes, the numbers of schools are increasing, and also are the number of states that are legislatively recognizing naturopathic physicians as primary care physicians.
So do you know how many accredited programs there are now in North America? You got an idea?
Probably about a dozen.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
Good.
including North America, so Canada also.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we're glad to have a future naturopath in our midst. Anyone else with that training or background here? Okay, so we hope you've got your eyes on a new textbook that you can use with your patients for high blood pressure.
Absolutely.
And what is that?
It's 30 days to reduce your blood pressure.
Oh, it's not our book, 30 Days to Natural Blood Pressure Control?
Oh, I'm assuming that was the title, but I
okay.
misspoke.
Okay, just wanted to keep the record straight. Anyone else want to get a word in or come up and be interviewed?
I think you scared people off. There's a hand over there.
Okay, good. So Jed's going to bring the mic back there. Jed, by the way, thanks for being such a good sport. I was interested to get a little better acquainted with you.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on when you covered meekness. I thought it was interesting that you talked about meekness being akin to submission. I've heard some different thoughts on meekness, specifically in reference to Moses. And it kind of goes along the idea of submission. And maybe I can get your own thoughts once I share what I've heard. But the Bible says that Moses was the meekest man on earth. And one of the things that you find is that Moses is constantly in stressful situations, right? And conflict, where people are accusing him. And Moses never defends his name. And when I was an assistant pastor under our senior pastor, who had been a pastor for years and years and years, I remember in one prayer meeting, he said, you know what meekness is? Meekness is when people are hurling insults at you. Meekness is when people are attacking your character, your name, your reputation, and you do not rise up to defend your own name. You let God defend your name and your character. Meekness is the willingness to basically submit even your reputation under God and allow Him to be your defense. That was just an observation that was running through my mind as you presented meekness, and I thought I'd share it.
No, I appreciate that insight. Reminds me of something that happened to me years ago. I'm often getting calls about people wanting me to speak in different places. And some years ago, this was a group from overseas that had invited me to speak somewhere. And I told them I was willing to consider it, but never heard from them again. And lo and behold, I find out that someone is disseminating information that I accepted an invitation to speak in this place and never showed up. And someone else had to fill my spot, and I'm thinking, well, here's this great injustice being done to my good name, saying that I had agreed to do something and then didn't show up. And so my first impulse was to defend myself. And the Lord put this thought into my mind, kind of what you're saying, that He can take care of my reputation. I don't have to be so concerned about what people say about me. And the other thought came to me, well, you know what? There's plenty of people that want me to speak in places or do things. It's not bad if a whole bunch of people just take me off their list. And the reason I mention that too is because we're often so concerned about how people see us, but sometimes it might be to your advantage for some people not to have a high opinion of you. Are you following along with me? So when we're trying to control our own destiny, then we're taking matters into our hands that really should be left in God's hands. Now, I'm not saying there's never a place to speak up, and I'm not sure that we want to leave with all the full implications here. If somehow God's character is being maligned in the process of maligning you, I think we both probably agree that might be a different scenario, especially if there's some kind of misunderstanding. Greg, am I falling into my typical mode of being too obtuse?
No, you're doing fine, I think. It's hard to define meekness. think it's easier to see it than it is to talk about it, isn't it? And so, I appreciated that Moses was the meekest person, because he went through so much conflict and so much difficulty. And yes, he did not defend himself per se when he was being insulted or treated poorly. Somebody else has a question?
I just wanted to make a statement.
Here, take the mic so we can all benefit from it.
I just wanted to make a statement that there was 2 leaders in Israel. One was milquetoast, and the other one was very stern for God's word. The people loved Aaron. Mrs. White says that he killed thousands of Israelites by being weak and wishy-washy.
So in the
So
episode,
how do we stand like Moses for God's word when people in the church don't really want to hear it?
no, it's an interesting question. So what he's referring to is, of course, Aaron and his role in creating the golden calf, so that when Moses comes down from receiving the 10 Commandments and God's law, he has allowed the people basically to make this golden calf. It's interesting to read his description of what happened. They brought the gold, he said, and out just came this golden calf. That's how he described it. Quite interesting. Yeah, so there's a need, like we've said, for aspiring for righteousness, for having high standards, and yet meekness is there too. And if we were to presume to try to give you all the answers this afternoon, we would be complicit in the crime of dumbing this down too much, wouldn't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And part of, I think, as we build our relationships and keep working on how we can be better relational people, that helps to ease the stress of struggling with some of these issues in our own lives. And I know that I've shared some burdens with people that I was really stressed about, and that just eased the tension so much to talk about things that were with somebody else, so that someone else who cared about you could help you through them, and maybe help encourage you to be stronger on something. Maybe Aaron should have been chatting with Moses a little bit more about his own feelings, and helping Aaron to be stronger on a specific point despite all the pressure.
Well, now I realize that may not have been a very good answer that I gave. I mean, Greg's was very good. And I know Josiah and Mila and Jed all may feel offended by things that I've said. So it's a perfect time to talk about the 5th beatitude, which is forgiveness. Okay? Forgiveness. So Greg, help us here.
Oh, this is such an important one, isn't it? It's so important. When we are unable to forgive, it causes great trials and tribulations for sometimes many, many years. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. I know in my own personal story, my mother, she's shared this publicly a number of times, so I feel comfortable sharing it. My mother got kicked out of a conservative Christian college for an infraction that she felt was relatively minor. And it was a pretty heavy hand that came down on her, and she had a really hard time forgiving that institution. And it ate at her over the years. It ate to the point that it was a deep bitterness that she had, and it deeply affected her own children, and it affected the life of the whole family. And so forgiveness is absolutely essential to retaining balance in your own life. You don't even realize that something's eating away at you oftentimes when you are holding a grudge. That someone may have done something to you 20 years ago. That person may be dead. And yet many of us are holding these things inside still. And we need to let them go and forgive.
It's really a profound topic, and there's solid biblical background for it. But I find in Christian circles, the concept of forgiveness is often shortchanged. Because as important as what we've been talking about is, forgiveness isn't merely not holding something against someone. It's not merely not wanting bad things to happen to someone who wronged you. But forgiveness is actually a two-way street. In other words, it's not just forgiving a person, not holding something against them, but it's actually about reconciling. Okay? So it's not just saying, oh, well, yes, they hurt me, I've forgiven them, that's it. It goes beyond that. You see it right here. The one wronged first chooses to forgive, but then for forgiveness to be complete, the wrongdoer actually has to accept that forgiveness. So there has to be a relational element for full biblical forgiveness to take place.
And one important point there is, depending on the details of the issue, it does happen frequently that the person who has been wronged, the person who wrongs the person who's been wronged, that person who has been wronged or sinned against or whatever you want to say, many times the wrongdoer has no idea. That happens a lot. And so Jesus actually in the Gospel of Matthew says that if someone offends you, it's your job to go and tell that person that they offended you. And that's part of the forgiveness process, a two-way street.
Yeah, so let's look at this, how this works. So on the cross, Jesus models this first aspect of forgiveness. So he's on the cross, he's basically on his path to death very soon after, and as he's being crucified from the cross, you hear these words, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." Okay? So what has Jesus chosen to do? He's chosen to forgive. Now here's the question. Was everyone then forgiven who was there at the cross? Jesus had chosen to forgive them, but if you read through the Bible story, they were not all forgiven. Okay? They had not accepted necessarily Jesus' forgiveness. He'd chosen to forgive, but in the way we know this is because as you read through what happens after Jesus' death and resurrection, on the day of Pentecost, Peter is preaching, and he's basically laying the guilt of Jesus' death on those who are there. And what is he calling them to do? He's calling them to repent. That's right. And so the point is, 3,000 of them, as you read that story in Acts 1 and 2, 3,000 of them repent and they accept Jesus' forgiveness. So Jesus chose to forgive everyone. His forgiveness was sufficient. It extended to everyone, but not everyone had received the forgiveness there at the cross. Do you see the difference? So this is what we're talking about. If we understand forgiveness from a biblical context, it's not just me going into my room and saying, boy, the pastor was really mean to me when I came to visit the church. You know, he looked the other way once when I was about to talk with him, and I'm not going to hold that against him. I'm going to forgive the pastor, but he was such a bad person, and whatever, but I forgave him. Well, if I never approach, by the way, it's not you, Pastor, because you never looked the wrong way, to my knowledge, when I was speaking with you. But the point is, like Greg was saying, he may be totally oblivious to it. Has this ever happened to you? Have you ever offended someone and not realized it? It's happened to me before. So, Greg, help us apply this a little bit more.
Okay, so Christianity embraced a counterintuitive worldview. As the Apostle Paul expresses it, I am a debtor. And so it's this idea that because of the grace that's been given us by God as Christians, that we have an obligation to go to whoever we can and embrace this counterintuitive worldview, that we have an obligation to pass that grace on, pass that mercy, that forgiveness on to others, even if they don't deserve it. Even if they're doing things that are harmful and hurtful, hurting me, hurting others, hurting my loved ones, God's calling us to have this debtor-like experience.
No, I mean, I think this is such an important point, because if someone wrongs you, I don't know if you've ever thought about this before, if someone wrongs you, it actually puts you in a position of power. Have you ever thought about this? You are actually in a position of power when someone has wronged you. And we express it this way: if you focus on the injustice, it will tend to polarize your relationships. It will not be redemptive for the other person. It will not be redemptive for you. But if you realize that because you've been wronged, you're in a position of power to actually respond to the other person with undeserved kindness, this can actually change that person's whole life history. But it involves confrontation. It's not just ignoring, not just acting like nothing happened. It involves confrontation to effectively forgive.
Yeah, forgiveness is about far more than forgetting or ignoring wrongs. If we are really interested in healed relationships, forgiveness requires confrontation. Many times individuals are unaware that they have hurt us. Consequently, we need to lovingly confront them and let them know how we have felt wronged, and then offer forgiveness. And we have a kind of a little template on the words you might use in a real insult that's occurred in your life. Here's an example. I've already chosen to forgive you. You really hurt me by doing such and such. But I want to let you know that I am choosing not to let that stand between the two of us. My offer of forgiveness, however, doesn't fully make amends until you accept it. That's why I am speaking to you now. And so we've really spelled it out there, and your version may be more brief or more prolonged, but it's this idea of being willing to share with others those personal issues and not being afraid to step out and do that.
Well, forgiveness has healing power. That's what the research shows. And if you actually look at the medical research, they have actually, there's multiple studies now out on forgiveness showing that it has healing benefits for things like fibromyalgia, can help with cancer, and of course the focus that we've been looking at is high blood pressure. It's an especially fascinating one from the other side of the country, isn't there, Greg?
Yeah, Florida Hospital did a very interesting study with Dr. Dick Tibbetts, and they actually orchestrated a whole forgiveness program to people who had anger issues. Imagine that. And their blood pressure tended to be high when they came into the program, which makes sense. And so as they went through the forgiveness process and this 8-week program that they put forth for them, those with elevated anger expression scores had significant reduction in those scores and significant reduction in blood pressure. Just a forgiveness program, that's it. Teaching them how to forgive through the insults and difficulties they sustained. And you know what? Many times Dr. Tibbetts tells his own personal story that he got laid off from a big organization. They were just doing large blanket layoffs of multiple departments. And so it had nothing to do with his own personal reputation or his own personal life, but he was very offended at that this organization could lay him off after he'd given so many years of hard work to it, right? And so it put him actually into a deep depression. He was very angry. It took him a long time to really overcome that, and he realized that he needed to learn forgiveness so much better, and so he began studying that very deeply, and eventually has been one of the leaders to teach all of us about how forgiveness is so important for your health and for your blood pressure, for your cardiovascular risk, etc.
Yeah, Dr. Tibbetts has a book called Forgive to Live. So that's a catchy title there that speaks about some of the healing power of forgiveness. Other researchers in discussing research like that of Dr. Tibbetts feels that basically some of the reasons for the benefits actually may have to do with this whole stress continuum. One of the references there, those of you sitting in the front row can see that first reference from one of the psychology journals. It's entitled Effects of a Group Forgiveness Intervention on Forgiveness Perceived Stress and trait anger. That's other research besides that of Dr. Tibbetts.
Yeah, we know that that your cortisol levels, your adrenaline levels, these levels that are high when you're under stress, that when you're dealing with chronic anger or even short-term anger, they're higher in your body. And so that's why your blood pressure goes up. That's why your risks start to go up over time. And so it's very important that we find ways to ease this anger and deal with it and actively pursue reconciliation whenever possible.
Well, Beatitude number 6 we've summarized as don't compromise. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Well, boy, compromise.
You know, I was just thinking about this beatitude on October 31st. Who knows about October 31st, what the 500th reunion of what was it? Do you remember? The Reformation, the beginning of the Reformation. And Martin Luther, at the Diet of Worms, when he's being confronted about his teachings and how he was being asked over and over to recant them, the Pope and the bishops and the various clergy were all urging him, recant your writings, recant your writings. And here he is standing there, and his famous quote, that here I stand, I can do no other. Right before then, he says, it is unwise for a man to go against his conscience. It is neither safe nor right. And how many of us have done things where we go against our conscience or repeatedly go against our conscience, and that compromise eats away at us. It eats away at our resolve, at our health, at many other factors. And so here we are, blessed are the pure in heart, getting back to that purity.
Well, if you look at a dictionary, modern dictionaries talk about purity, especially in the moral realm. And it's quite interesting. It's very interesting to me that there's many people who've wanted to shelve morality and shelve right and wrong, but there's a whole lot of discussion today in America about purity. They might not be using that term, but about what's proper in relationships. And it's very interesting that really the focus is on a society that has really set aside moral values and now are realizing that not everything does go. It's very interesting when you think about where we're at, because compromise has often seemed to be ruling the day, and we're realizing that that serpent is coming back to bite us, if you will. So let's look a little bit at purity, moral purity in the biblical world. Greg, is it safe to say that people, when they acted in defense of purity, when they stood for what was morally right, things always went well for them?
Actually, most of the time, things went terrible for them. Or maybe that's a little strong word. It didn't go well. You know, if you look at Joseph's story, you know, the classic story of Joseph, you know, the son of Jacob, you know, he was sold to slavery. Do you remember that story? By his brothers. And there he was, finally getting out of prison and working for Potiphar. And then Potiphar's wife wanted to have a sexual relationship with him. And what did he say? He said, you know, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And so he felt that moral purity was more important than pleasing the wife of his master. And so she turned on him then and falsely accused him. And where did he end up?
Back in prison.
That's right.
This is a very relevant story in our contemporary dialogue here, because in today's society, we would say some interesting things. If Joseph had given in, would he have done the right thing? If Joseph had given in today's society, instead of saying Joseph did anything wrong, they would say Joseph was a victim, okay? And he was, they would even use the word raped by his owner or his mistress. Now, I'm not trying to minimize the terrible things that are coming to light in the media today, but it's very interesting that we're not hearing discussion about the role of purity in those who we are always labeling victims. Are you following along with what I'm saying here? I'm saying there that don't, and I some of you, I might be on the verge of getting some of you angry and throwing things at me. I understand this. But I'm trying to help you see it from a biblical context. When there's an abuse of power, it doesn't mean when you're in a position of little or no, or seemingly no power, that then you do not have any moral responsibilities. Okay? You following along? And I think there is something else in the dialogue that we're not talking about, because many of us absolve ourselves of moral responsibility when we feel that from a secular standpoint, we don't have any options. Joseph could have reasoned the very same thing. He is subservient. He's a slave. He has to give in to his master's wife. But the whole point of the story is that there is something higher than secular considerations. And of course, I'm not expecting society to understand that, because they've largely tried to shelve God from the dialogue. But I'm saying that yes, there rightfully, there are terrible things that are being done by people that have power. I mean, sickening things. I mean, things that I cannot even comprehend, okay? I'm not minimizing that in any way. But what I am saying is, just because there's these terrible abuses of power does not mean that in every case the victim was without responsibility as well. And I know that's not a popular thing to talk about, but we're talking about it because the call for us is to be morally pure, even if we are in a situation where we have little power and it seems like it's dooming our future. Didn't it? I mean, to Joseph, couldn't he have reasoned that if I don't go along, I mean, what's his future now in the prison?
I mean, the next day, you know, in that day, if they had reporters and journalism, what would the headlines have said? You know, Joseph did something terrible, and he gets what he deserves, probably. When in fact, it was exactly the opposite, that Joseph was going after moral purity and was choosing that, and yet the worst things happened to him. And yet somehow, as you read the story, things get a lot better for him later.
Yeah, I mean, it's his path to the throne is his moral purity and not compromising. Well, basically, if we were to fully flesh all this out, when you compromise, you become guilty, okay? So not only might you be abused, but you're also guilty if you were in any way complicit because of moral failure. Now, just hang with me here. I deal with a lot of people. I work right now in an underserved clinical population, and I have many people who are victims of abuse and other things, and do not for a minute think that I'm blaming anyone who is the victim of abuse. Many times they are totally blameless, but they're not always that way. And let me give you a classic example. In my day, if two people were out drinking and some things happened that ended up maybe in the birth of a child, they would realize they were both foolish and responsible for the decision they made being drunk. In today's dialogue, if two people are drinking and the same thing happens, one of the parties can say that they didn't give consent and that they were sexually abused. Do you understand where I'm coming from? I'm saying there are consequences to lack of moral purity, and society's standards will change. That's all I'm saying. I'm just asking you to think about that. I'm not weighing in on where I stand, because like I said, some of you should be angry about what's happening in our society, and I'm not trying to side with abusers or trying to blame victims. Don't misunderstand where I'm coming from. I'm just saying we try to make all these things black and white, and I'm saying each of us has a personal responsibility to moral purity. You following along? Okay? So I just want to be clear about that because from a health standpoint, if you compromise your moral purity, it doesn't matter what the world says. If you feel that you have compromised your values, even if you get a big settlement, you get a bunch of money, you're going to feel guilty, and it's going to undermine your health. And there's actually research that affirms this. And I don't know that we need to, I think we've spent enough time, because I realize that this clock, I don't know why they did this to us, but they put a very fast clock in the back of the room, and it's disturbing me greatly.
And another point, that's a very important point. It's really about being accurate, right? Being accurate with the way the guilt goes. And many people also feel guilty about stuff they ought not to feel guilty about, right? And so it's very important that we're accurate about this compromise, this finding that right experience, what's right, what's wrong, and really being careful, because if we feel guilty, about something in a much broader way than we ought to, that's not right. And if we lack guilt when we ought to have guilt, that's not right either. And so we need to find balance in that process.
Okay, let me try to dig myself out of this hole a little bit more, guys. Just so you hear one other part of the story, since Greg graciously stayed with this topic for a little bit longer. Do you all realize that we have a human protective instinct to blame victims? Whether it's a car accident or a personal assault, a rape, whatever it might be. You see, if someone's in a car accident, I say, they were hit by a drunk driver. Well, they must have been doing something wrong. They probably weren't, watching, If you get hit by a drunk driver, I mean, the guy was probably driving erratically. Have you ever gone through this process, realized that we tend to do this? If a woman is raped, what do we tend to say? Well, where was she? I mean, what was she wearing? Are you following along? What does human nature do that? Why does it do it? It's because if I can blame the victim, then it helps distance myself from that situation. See, I would never do that. A drunk driver wouldn't hit me because I'm always watching the road. If I saw someone driving, if I saw a car coming toward me, if it looked, I would slow down. They're ridiculous things, okay? But our tendency is to blame victims. And I tell you that because what happens is when someone undergoes something terrible, an abusive situation or some traumatic event, we often distance ourselves from the person. So let me put that word in too, because we need to come close to people who are victimized, because this is our human lot. All of us to some extent, but for God's intervention, are going to undergo, Jesus put it this way, in the world you'll have tribulation. Another place it says all those that live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution, right? Okay. We gotta hasten on, Greg, because we've covered more in this hour than we did in the first hour, but we wanted to give people a break before 4 o'clock, and we've got 2 more of these Beatitudes to cover. So why don't you give us a couple high points on mediation?
All right, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. So this is the idea of mediation, finding those who are in conflict and being a peacemaker between them. So, that's what the Bible is really all about, a mediation process between God and humanity. And so we know that peacemaking is very important.
That was a good summary, Greg. So peacemaking's important. Hostility's bad, isn't it? That was good.
Right, yeah.
I don't know that I could have said it as eloquently.
We went through about 20 thoughts right then. Did you see all that?
Well, some people think it's a subtle way of advertising the book when we go through the slides quickly because it's all there. But really, that's not why we're doing it. We know some of you want to hear about the brain health topic, and we still wanted to make sure you got to see all the slides. And some of you felt we were going too slow anyway. So now you can't complain after the lecture that all the material was covered at such a slow rate. We actually, this last couple minutes, right, we're giving them a lot of material.
Yeah, we're going really fast, so fast that we can't even talk about it.
So persistence.
Persistence, yeah, it's...
Greg, do I need to go over anger again with you and forgiveness? Or?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
We're doing fine. This is a lot of material, and it's not easy to cover it all. So blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness. One of the most important things that I think it's important to talk about when you make health behavior changes is not everyone in your life is going to like what you're doing, right? They might even persecute you a little bit, huh? Right? You're trying to eat healthier, and your loved one wants to go out to, X restaurant that you can't find anything healthy there, pretty much, right? Or you're trying to, start exercising more, and your beloved is sabotaging you with extra donuts or whatever, There's all sorts of scenarios. And so having grace and standing up and realizing and being patient in the midst of other people persecuting you, so to speak, is an important value to have. If you cannot stand up in the midst of this, quotes, persecution, however you want to describe it, you will fall away from the health habits you're trying to improve. Isn't that right? And so it's a very important topic.
So the message here is that the only way to really develop patience is to have your patience tried. You aware of that? That's how we develop patience.
That's what your spouse is there for, right? And your children.
So basically, this beatitude talks about being persecuted, but then Jesus says, rejoice and be extremely glad. So in the face of difficulty, if you can rejoice and patiently endure and persist, there are health benefits, and those health benefits have been documented in the research literature, whether it's persistence that develops when you're being bullied, whether it's persistence when you're receiving other types of abuse or violent behavior. But basically, when we submit, when we persist, when we persevere, this gives us strength. Why don't you walk us through this study, because it's an example from outside the Christian world, but it illustrates this point.
Oh yeah, this is an interesting study. So researchers from Iran assessed 252 Iranian male and female college students. Those with greater levels of patience, they measured it in a variety of ways, interpersonal style, life hardships, daily hassles, actually had better health. Interesting, huh? When they looked at it from the viewpoint of patience, those who had been tested more in that area actually had better health. Interesting. So bring it on, right? Maybe not that same experience, but definitely we should not be so scared of conflict and trial, because it makes us stronger when we have to go through those things, to stand up for that principle that we've really finally grabbed onto. I finally grabbed onto, whatever that thing is that you want to grab onto. And you're grabbing onto it, and then various forces start railing against you. Don't give up. Just keep holding on, and it'll strengthen you and give you better health.
Yeah, it's very interesting. They had less depression, lower levels of anxiety. It's because they were patient in the face of abuse. And this has been shown in Christian populations as well, and other populations. So patience in the face of obstacles is basically part of what God wants for you. And I suggest to people that one of the best places to develop patience, believe it or not, is in a faith community. No, really. And you think about it for a minute. Can you disown your family? I mean, you actually could, right? But you'll still have the same last name, you'll still have the same genes, you'll still have that same life history. I mean, how about can you quit your place of work? Can you quit your job? You could. Maybe it would be a real hardship to do it. So you can take abuse from family, you can take abuse from work. Well, that kind of comes along with the landscape, but faith community involvement is entirely voluntary, isn't it? Very interesting to think about it. And so many people say, well, I go to a faith community because everyone's warm and loving and kind to me, and if they treat me mean, I'm just going to leave. Well, no. Actually, if they treat you mean, that may be the most valuable thing you're getting from that faith community. Okay? Now, by the way, we're glad that you folks all seem to be pretty nice around here. But my whole point is don't look at it this way. Don't think that if you're in the right place, that everything is going to go smoothly. God does allow difficulties many times in our lives because he's trying to give us a higher experience. Well, we need to wind up on that note. We are going to give you at least a 5-minute break because you've been sitting for quite a while. Our 4 o'clock presentation will start once we get a critical mass here. We'll give you 5 or 10 minutes. Then we're going to go just for an hour for our final presentation. We're going to focus on brain health. We will come back to a more solidly health-focused presentation. We'll be speaking about a number of things that can undermine brain health. So we'll really kind of finish this connection between spirituality and health. Not that there might not be some aside that comes up, but really our focus will be more on those medical topics. And then at the end of that presentation, we will have some resources, books and videos and things for sale as well.